Welcome to the Faith Together podcast from the Center for Faith and Family at Olivet Nazarene University. If you believe that passing down Christian faith is essential for the next generation, you are in the right place. Enjoy conversations with guests who are faith practitioners, parents, caregivers, pastors, counselors, and many more. You'll enjoy practical tools and community for passing down Christian faith to your children and grandchildren.
Well, welcome back to the Faith Together podcast, everybody. I'm Lindsey, and I'm joined today with Leon. Hi, Leon.
Hi, Lindsey.
It's great to be back as we are on our second episode of a really important conversation.
Yes, and I'm so glad that Dr. Frisius has joined us for this.
Yes, Dr. Frisius, welcome back. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
If you are joining us for the first time today, we're so glad you're here, and we would recommend you just hit pause and go back to our podcast from last week on our first episode of this new season and this series on how to study the Bible, because it is really intentional, right, Leon, to listen to these in order.
Yeah, there's a progression that Dr. Frisius has taken us through that I think by the time we get to the end of the series, it will be very beneficial. Yeah.
So today is week 2 of how to study the Bible. Last week, Dr. Frisius shared with us just kind of some basic takeaways of what the Bible is, why it's important, and why we need to read it, and how we can read it for ourselves and share it with our kids at home. And so today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the conversation and talk about literary context.
Yeah, so we definitely want to talk about what is the setting of the books and how they kind of operate and function, in part because they're written material, right? And they're communicating to us in particular ways. And so we want to start trying to get a bit of a handle on why literary context is important to us and kind of what are some of the things we want to be looking for.
So literary context, for those of us in the academic biblical world, that's just an everyday phrase. So maybe some of our people may not know fully what that means. And that's not implying that anybody isn't smart or anything like that. But if you're not living in that world, it may be an unfamiliar phrase to you. So unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so I would just kind of define it as, what type of writing am I looking at here? Am I reading a letter? Am I reading a ancient biography? What exactly is in front of me here, and what are the expectations that the author would have for me as a reader?
Right. So if we're outside of the Bible and I have a poetry book in front of me and I'm reading some poet, some famous...
I always think of Robert Frost.
Okay, there we go. We read Robert Frost. We know going into it that we're not going to read this the same way that we would read if we were reading a history book.
Right.
The words don't mean what they mean. I mean, they don't mean what they are. He's playing with the words. He's using them in a way that the words together have a unique kind of meaning than if you were just to read them on their own. And so that's part of what we're recognizing is that Scripture, we have to understand when we're reading Scripture, which kind of literature is it that we're reading?
Right. And part of that is that, as you were pointing out, Leon, like there are different ways that we read a genre or a type of writing. And if we take a history book and we read it like it's a book of poetry, where the words don't always quite mean what on the surface they would mean, we suddenly get a very, very different understanding of history. And same if we took like a poem and we read it as like it was a straightforward literal account of something. We're not reading it how the author has intended it to be communicated to us.
And I think most people would be a bit surprised on how much of Scripture is poetic.
Right. So much of it is going to end up being poetic. Even things that on their surface appear to be maybe a little bit more of a historical or a prophetic. There's a lot of kind of we'll call it figurative, where the words have a deeper meaning than just kind of what the surface level or the normal meaning of a word is going to be.
Yeah, and part of that is because the ancient Hebrew people communicated that way. That was their way of communicating. It's not like they said, oh, let's write all these poetic things in the text. That's just who they are.
Right.
Right?
And the challenge, I think, for us is that we are not that way as a culture, right?
Yes.
We want information, right? We have information technology, right, all over the place, and we're just we're wanting data.
Yeah, we do have information all over the place, yet communication remains to be really difficult at times, right? Like we misunderstand one another. We think someone's saying one thing, but they're really meaning this. And writing and reading of scripture is communication, and it can be difficult to understand.
And so much of that, Lindsey, is even like within the current generations that we have now. Mm-hmm. The lack of communication between generations. I mean, I talk to college students and they use language that I don't understand. They use words that I don't understand. And or by the time I figure out what those words are and I start using them, they say to me, "Oh, we don't use that. We don't say that anymore."
Right.
That's old. That's yesterday.
Yeah.
We don't do that. So imagine now we're going back thousands of years, and we're trying to go into an ancient culture, and we're trying to listen to the way that they think about things and the way they understand words.
Well, and isn't it true that in Scripture, some things are just truly descriptive? It's just describing something that happened. It's not always prescriptive, like you need to do it this way.
That's right.
Sometimes we can misinterpret things that are descriptive to be prescriptive, or things that are prescriptive to be descriptive. It just can be confusing.
Right. Yeah. Some things are just there to kind of push the narrative forward. And the way in which they even think about telling their history is very different than how we would think about telling history.
Yeah. So take us on that journey. What do we need to know about literary context that will help us to better understand Scripture?
Yeah. So first, I want to kind of reiterate the point. Like, communication is hard. So just even think about like oral communication when you can see the person. And then think about how many times you've been misunderstood over the week. Think of like when your husband or wife hasn't understood what you meant, the coworker, or your children when you have clearly explained to them exactly what you want from them, and they go and do something completely different. Right. So think about maybe a preteen or a teen who argues with you about your exact wording, even though your intention is really, really clear, or at least you were sure it was clear, but not to them. Right. So, and then think about how much we communicate with our hands. Right. When we're talking, I'm even like explaining it with moving my hands on a podcast. Like, what's wrong with me? But also think about our inflection. Right. Tone. Think about eye rolls, right? Those communicate a great deal as somebody is talking to us. Our body posture, all of these things. And now consider that we have to limit it all to just something that's written.
Yeah.
Right?
I think a lot about the Psalms. These were songs written with music, played by instruments, and we have words. And, I think about the songs that we listen to today and how the message would be different if all we had were the words. And so there's a limit even like in the Psalms for us to try to recognize, okay, these were part of the temple hymnal, so to speak, that were sung by these people as reminders of God's work in their lives, of the faithfulness of God, how to deal with things when things were hard and those kind of things, that we lose all of that. And so we have to try to recreate that. And so what do? We have musical groups today that take the Psalms and put them to music because they know they communicate so well.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So we lose out a lot, and the original cultures that are writing these are probably more of an oral communication culture anyway, that they would read the Bible out loud to each other, in part because most of them couldn't read. Right, so it was meant to be read out loud, and so there were all these aspects that come to it that when we're just seeing the words on the page, we sometimes end up missing out on some of those.
Yeah.
Communication can be hard, even like as I was talking about when we share the same space with. I'm a millennial. Actually, I'm a Gen X. I'll be honest. Right, I'm a Gen X.
You're an X. Huh?
And just think about talking to Gen Z, and you're like, my kids were trying to explain to me some of the phrases, and I'm like, why do you do that? Right? And they were just kind of, the eye roll from before, right? Like your dad, you're just old, right? So even when we share the same space, right, communication is hard, even when we have the same set of rules that we're kind of all trying to play by. And so I always kind of think, when I think about this, of playing a game. When we play a game, maybe imagine playing a game with your kids that they've made up. They've created it, and there's this set of rules that they've told you about, but then there are some additional rules that are hidden, right? That they don't tell you about. And so as you're playing the game, they pop the surprise on you. And it's always kind of amazing because as they change kind of those rules, it always benefits them, right? And they add rules that are convenient and those sorts of things. And when it comes to reading the Bible, then I think oftentimes we're kind of like our kids creating a game. We take our own rules, we change the rules as we kind of go, and we don't follow the original rules of the game. And because of that, then we end up playing wrong. Things don't quite fit together right and piece themselves together correctly. And we sometimes then wonder, like, why does this not making so much sense to me? And a lot of times it's because we're missing out on what are the rules that help that particular piece of literature work, the set of expectations that they would have. And so I think it's really kind of important for us to at least know a little bit more about kind of this idea of literature and the context of the environment in which these books are being produced.
So are you proposing to us then that there are some things we know about the ancient world of the Bible as far as the way they viewed the world and the way they understood communication through literature that we can learn from?
Right, yeah. And some of it is just kind of becoming a little bit more familiar. I don't think we need to, you asked me last week, Leon, like, do we have to have a Bible degree to be able to do this? I don't think so, but there are just certain practices that we can start putting into place that are going to help us kind of move away from the way that our culture would approach reading something and start to at least be a little bit more aware of the way that their culture would be reading something.
Yeah, I'm eager to hear some of those practices because I think a lot of our listeners, myself included, are thinking through, okay, I've maybe made up my own rules at times when I'm reading the Bible. I've fit it to what I think works. How do we avoid doing that? What are some of the practices you see to be helpful?
Right. One of my big kind of presuppositions or ideas is, if I read the Bible and it says exactly what I expect it to say, I've probably done something wrong. If it completely agrees with my point of view, I've probably inserted myself into it and used kind of my own ideas to make the Bible say what I want to say. So I oftentimes will joke, like, the next time somebody agrees with me completely is the first time somebody will agree with me completely. And I think the same with the Bible. If the Bible is completely agreeing with me, I might have done something wrong. That's a clue.
Okay.
Right? Like, maybe not.
So it should challenge us.
It should
challenge us.
I think the second that we think we've got the Bible all figured out is the second that we should think, I don't. And I need to go back to it. And I need to, never underestimate like the power of being in conversation with people for that too. To be talking with others who have spent time learning about different things than you have. And that can oftentimes be very, very helpful to us.
I relate to that point because I say many times in my life as I'm following Jesus and sharing life with others, I'll say things like, well, I know it was God if it wasn't my idea. Because usually he does want to challenge us. He does want to push us out of our comfort zones. And I think that's true to what your point is about not allowing it to just not surprise us and not challenge us. So,
right.
Yeah.
So you want to share with us then some of those things that we know that can help us?
So let me give a few other kind of principles or ideas to kind of think about or practices. So one is the practice that I call the outward expanding circles. So think about a small circle and then it gets a little bit bigger, it gets a little bit bigger, it gets a little bit bigger. And kind of think about approaching the text that way. So you start with maybe a word or a sentence, and then you look at the sentence that comes before and the sentence that comes after, and then you keep doing that. And one of the things that I oftentimes tell my students is, if a verse doesn't make any sense, read the one that comes before and after. And if it still doesn't make sense, do it again and do it again. And as you continue to kind of push it forward, now you're reading a paragraph, you're seeing how does that particular verse fit within the material that surrounds it. The ultimate goal is to eventually you put it into the whole book. And you're asking yourself as you're doing that, as my circle gets bigger and bigger, how does my particular verse or passage fit within the bigger scope of what the book is trying to accomplish?
Boy, if that's all we did, that would make such a huge difference. I mean, I know there's many other things that we can do, but if we just started there, that would make such a big difference. So we mentioned Jeremiah 29:11 last week.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you read verses 1 through 10 before you get to 11, you realize that that verse takes on a totally different meaning when you understand that the people that it was written to were getting ready to go into bondage for 70 years, and God was sending them there.
Mm-hmm.
But he knows plans that he has for their future, and he's not going to abandon them. That's very different than this rosy understanding of Jeremiah 29:11, where everything's going to be fine because God knows plans for me.
Right. And oftentimes this approach is maybe a little easier on some of the smaller books, right?
Yeah.
And then some of the books, it's not going to work as well. So a book like Psalms, where, the chapters, a lot of the wisdom literature, that there's individual thoughts that are going on there. But for the most part, for most of the Bible, if we're using that kind of expanding circles, is going to be of good help for us.
I also think when we're reading a smaller book of the Bible, like a letter from Paul. So Galatians, for example, is a book that I'm reading right now. I took some time to just read the whole book in one sitting, just to get my mind around, okay, this is a letter that he's writing to this church. Let's read it like we would read a letter. You wouldn't just read a few sentences of a letter someone was sending you. You would read the whole thing and then go back. And so I think that that's helpful too. If it's a smaller book of the Bible you want to focus on, being able to sit down, read it in one sitting, and then go back to it.
Right. And don't hesitate to have a notebook and a pen next to you and just kind of jot down, like, here's some of the things that I'm seeing. Wow, Paul really does not like circumcision for salvation. Like, you want to make a note of that. And then as you're looking at individual passages, you're like, okay, if I come up with something that says, hey, circumcision is a great thing for you to become a Christian, I've maybe made a mistake here because it's not within the flow of the rest of the book.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also believe that words really matter, correct? Like for our reading and for our interpretation of Scripture.
Right. I think one of our tendencies is oftentimes, as we talked about familiarity last week. And so we have a picture in our minds of what the words are. And oftentimes when we go back and actually see the words that are there, like, ooh, I forgot that part was there. And that really kind of colors our impression of what a verse is saying when we actually see the words that are there rather than the ones that we think should be there. And this also, I think within this, then we also have to remember that words change over time. Keep in mind, right, we're reading a book that was written over a span conservatively of about 1,000 years. Words change all the time. So I kind of thought of a couple of examples as you all were kind of talking about this. So the first one is, Lindsey, you are nice.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Because we spoke to you in the 21st century. Now, if I'd said you're nice like 150 years ago, you would not have said thank you to me.
Right.
You would have been offended, right? I would have given you a pretty grievous insult. But that word has changed, and it kind of changes a little bit too, like with your tone. Like, yeah, you're so nice. All right,
that's true.
I just said something very different to you.
Yeah, that's a good example.
So you are nice is a pretty kind of is an example of words that kind of change, and then even in my lifetime, other words have changed. So I think my classic example is the Flintstones theme song. Right, you're going to have a gay old time. It's meaning something different than how we would use gay in our contemporary context. And so when we read, we have to kind of keep in mind that sometimes the way in which a particular author uses a word could be very different than how another author uses that term. Based upon time, based upon what they're trying to talk about, those things can change. One of the things that I would kind of encourage you to do is to say, how is my author using a particular word? You can do that by going and finding all the places where that word shows up. A lot easier to be done in a Google age. But you kind of do that. And kind of a good example of that, I think, is probably how Paul talks about faith and how James talks about faith. And this has oftentimes led people to think like James and Paul like don't agree with each other. But they're talking about faith in two different ways. And again, we have to kind of be looking for how do different authors use the same word.
Yeah, and I find it helpful, especially in my study Bible. There is usually an intro page to each book of the Bible that gives you a little tidbit on the author. So for our listeners out there, if you're, using a study Bible or have access to one, that's helpful to just read about the author, to give a little background.
Right. Yeah. Because we're all products of the environment that we've grown up in and the way that we communicate. And so knowing a little bit about that is only going to help us. It might not solve everything for us. And none of these things that we'll talk about today, the next week, and the next week is going to solve every question that we're ever going to have. But there's steps in a direction that help us.
You've been listening to the Faith Together podcast from the Center for Faith and Family at Olivet Nazarene University. Sign up for additional resources at centerff.com. When building faith, we are better together.